I am married to Mark, who tolerates my borderline criminal-level devotion to the San Francisco 49ers. He calls it enthusiastic. I call it a public service. Weekends during football season look like a ritual. Tailgate at dawn, tactical deployment of a folding chair, chili that smells like victory and questionable hygiene, friends who know the exact time to show up with a six-pack and a sense of humor. I collect jerseys like tax-deductible emotional support items, and if you ever need someone to recite a play-by-play from the 2012 season verbatim, I am your person. That is my life outside the office, loud, messy, and unrepentantly football-obsessed. By day, I am the day-to-day lead on several accounts at a mid-size consulting firm. I enjoy the chess of it. Client strategy sessions, the quiet cruelty of an Excel model that finally balances the small pleasures of making complex things appear elegantly simple. My job requires diplomacy, stamina, and the occasional ability to find humor in corporate carnage. I am competent, I care about my clients, and I have learned how to be both firm and likable in boardrooms. I was not expecting to be tested on the subject of gratitude, or on how much professional courtesy one man would mistake for permission. There was one client in particular who knew I was a zealot. Michael Turner, calm, sharp, with a laugh that smoothed over tense conversations, had been on one of my accounts for a couple years. He and I wound up becoming genuine friends. Lunches that wandered into politics and fantasy football strategies, after-work drinks where we would sit around and joke about the absurdities of corporate life. He knew about my tailgates. He knew about my jerseys. He knew, in very specific detail, that if the 49ers were in the Super Bowl and I had any conceivable way to attend, I would be there in a heartbeat. A few weeks before the big game, Michael mentioned in passing that he had access to a pair of extra company seats. They were company tickets, the kind that say corporate hospitality on paper and front row jealousy in spirit. He said with an offhand smile that made me do a small, involuntary calculation in my head about probability and luck that he wanted to give them to me as a thank you for all the work I'd done on his account. I blushed like someone who had just been handed a secret handshake. It is one thing to be recognized in a memo. It is another to be offered, with no bureaucratic fanfare, a pair of tickets to the Super Bowl. Michael was not the kind of person who gave meaningless gifts. This felt genuine and personal. Because it was a bit awkward for him to hand over corporate tickets directly to me, he told me later that he had given them to one of our partners, Steve, to deliver as a surprise. "Steve will get you the details," Michael said, like it was a small logistical footnote. I trusted him. I trusted both of them. Steve and I were colleagues, not close friends. He was an experienced partner who mostly stayed in his lane and managed client relationships with the kind of neutral charm that keeps things profitable. I pictured a neat exchange. Steve would drop by with envelopes, we'd exchange polite thank yous, and I would be that person at the Super Bowl wearing a ridiculous foam hat with pride. Game day came and went. The 49ers made it to the Super Bowl, which in my world was already as close to destiny as modern sports allow. And they lost in a way that still feels raw when I think of it. I watched on TV with Mark and friends, and we did the rituals of being fans. The curses, the hugs, the philosophical questions about what loyalty means when the scoreboard reads the wrong thing. I did not go to the stadium. In the immediate fog after the loss, it did not occur to me to ask Steve about the tickets. People assumed I had been there. People assumed I had not. It was a small, ridiculous ambiguity in a season of giant feelings. A few days later, Michael and I met for drinks after a meeting. The kind of informal debrief that doubles as the next best thing to a therapy session. He sipped his gin and, smiling but with a crease of concern I recognized from seeing him hand over business proposals, said, "Hey, by the way, why didn't you go to the game? I heard someone else was in your seats." I blinked. "What game?" I asked, because apparently my brain was still operating on the retired plays of denial. "The Super Bowl," he said, like he was setting down an object that suddenly looked heavier. Confused, I answered honestly, "I didn't have seats to the Super Bowl. I thought you were giving them to me." Michael's face went from puzzled to a shade I recognized as hurt. "I did give them to Steve for you," he said, like explaining the obvious. He was supposed to give them to you as a surprise. My stomach dropped in the way it only does when something small feels like a personal betrayal. I have had worse days, but not many. For a few beats, I tried to map out alternate realities. Did I accidentally misplace a text? Was there a miscommunication, a clerical error, an honest mistake in the office chaos? Michael looked at me with the kind of look friends give one another when the world is a little less trustworthy than it had been 5 minutes earlier. "Quietly ask around and let me know," he said, the request soft but earnest. The next week, I shuffled back through the office like a person who had smelled smoke and was trying to find the source. Offices have ecosystems of whisper and rumor, and in that ecosystem, the secretaries are a cathedral choir, accurate, observant, and rarely wrong. One of them, with the practiced neutrality of someone who runs the calendar for 30 people and has seen everything, told me that Steve had given a pair of Super Bowl tickets to another client as a company gift. Another client. Not me. He had handed them, the ones Michael had given him expressly for me, to another account, a real person client. A colleague later confirmed that it was Laura Bennett, a client who had been cultivating a new relationship with Steve's partner group. She was in her 30s, poised, and the sort of person who could make a $50,000 consulting retainer sound like an earnest handshake. The tickets were used as a gesture. They were not returned. They were in Laura Bennett's hands. I stood there in the cubicle farm and felt the familiar boil of anger that comes from being treated like an optional extra. Not because the 49ers had lost, because I knew they had, but because this felt deliberate. These were tickets on the 30-yard line, a small corridor of the world where people look at you and think you belong there. It was not just a sporting event. It was a symbol. It was generosity weaponized into social capital, and it had been redirected without explanation. Under different circumstances, if this had been an honest scheduling snafu, or if Steve had apologized immediately, or if he had genuinely thought I was unable to go, I might have let it slide. I value workplace peace. I value not making every hallway into a trial. But this was not a schedule conflict. This was a choice. Michael had given his tickets to me personally as a thank you, and somebody in our firm had decided they were better used elsewhere. I thought briefly about confronting Steve directly. I imagined the scene, a calm meeting in his office, an exchange of words that led to an apology and a reimbursement, the firm slapping a metaphorical bandage on the wound. But when I played it through in my head, another detail kept surfacing. Michael had noticed. Michael, the very person who had gone out of his way to recognize my work, had been the one to call this out first. If I let him handle the situation, the accountability would not land on me. It would land on Steve, and that was the thing that tilted the scale. So I decided not to storm into Steve's office and deliver an impassioned lecture on professional ethics. I chose instead to let the person who had been wronged by Steve's unilateral choice handle it. There is power in letting a generous person's indignation be the instrument of correction. It leaves fewer traces of petty retribution on your own record and places the moral spotlight where it belongs. I sat with the annoyance and let it settle into strategy. I would give Michael the space to be offended on my behalf, and I would be honest, candid, and composed. I would not create a spectacle, but I would not forget either. The tickets had been meant for me, and that fact, like an ember, glowed with its own insistence. When Michael texted me after I'd asked him quietly what had happened, his messages came fast and blunt, not angry so much as incredulous and protective. "Are you kidding me?" he wrote, caps, exclamation points, the whole dramatic package, then immediately followed with, "Pretend I never told you. Let me handle this." I could practically see him smoothing his tie over the text. He did not leave it to chance. A few days later, we were summoned, not to an ordinary call, but to a formal meeting at his office. "Bring the partner," he told me. "I want this cleared up in person." Steve and I booked flights the next week. He was mild and professional, the kind of person who packs a blazer and a practiced apology just in case. I kept my phone in my pocket and told myself I'd be calm. That was true until the actual set piece began. We walked into the conference room, and everything looked normal at first. Polished table, flat screen with a prepared slide deck, the usual cluster of faces who attend these meetings out of obligation rather than joy. Then, Michael made the introductions with a deliberately casual flourish. "Steve, this is Stephanie Hale, vice president from over at corporate," he said, nodding toward a woman in her 30s who had an easy smile and an impeccable blazer. Stephanie wanted to sit in on our meeting today. Stephanie stood, reached forward, and offered her hand. "Oh, I don't think we've met," she said with sincere confusion. "Did we meet at the game? I'm terrible with faces after a long day." Her voice was syrupy and polite, the kind of voice you use when you're setting a mousetrap and want the mouse to be unwittingly cooperative. Michael looked at me, eyebrows raised, and I realized he was cueing me. "Sorry, Michael," I said, playing my part. "I wasn't there. Are you thinking of someone else?" The thing about well-crafted humiliation is that it's almost gentle at first. Steve's face went from curved neutrality to a slowly expanding heat. He tried to interject, but Stephanie laughed lightly over him, as if he were background noise. "No, so-and-so from other company was sitting in those seats," she said, perfectly casual. "By the way, I was wondering why we gave company seats to those guys. Is there a project we're working on with them that I don't know about?" She phrased it like a genuine question, but the implication was surgical. Those seats did not belong to any project tied to Stephanie's group. They belonged to a single thank you gift Michael had intended for me. Michael leaned forward and said, "Steve, I gave you those tickets for OP. Did you give them away to someone else? Was it another client?" Steve, now visibly uncomfortable, stammered something about a mix-up in the office. He tried to cast his eyes toward me, a classic search for a bridge move, but the room had already leaned into the joke. He was the one without a script. Then Michael said, in a voice low enough to cut through pretense, but loud enough for every person in the room to hear, "Those tickets were a personal thank you from me to her." He let the sentence hang. You could have heard a pen drop. Steve's mouth opened. He blinked. He rearranged his posture like he was trying to retreat into a smaller, less culpable version of himself. Steve gathered his briefcase as if he might salvage the meeting with a professional recovery, but Michael's next move was precise. "I think this meeting is over," he said. "OP, it seems as if I owe you a thank you gift. Let's go to lunch. Stephanie, you're welcome to join. Steve, I need to evaluate our relationship. Please go back home and expect to hear from us next week." Steve tried to argue, to be conciliatory, to do damage control. Stephanie, who up to that point had been playing a dignified outsider, looked at him, cool and unwavering. "I don't think that's a good idea," she said. The front desk was instructed to see him out. They did it with that delicious formal politeness that occasionally smells like exile. When Steve stepped into the elevator, something remarkable happened. The room lost its pretense and everyone broke into laughter. Not the cruel, mean-spirited kind. A release. Michael's little staged moment had punctured a tension none of us had known how to name. Stephanie slipped into a seat across from me, and we went to lunch like conspirators who had just witnessed a perfectly executed trap. Turns out Stephanie wasn't actually a vice president. She was an employee Michael had recruited for the bit because she was game, quick-witted, and, as it turned out, a full-on 49ers fan herself. She loved the surprise plan and loved, even more, the aftermath. Lunch was loud, giddy, and celebratory in a way that felt like solidarity. She and I compared ridiculous tailgate hacks. Michael paid for the meal and made a show of it, which, in this context, felt like an exclamation point on the reveal. Then the practicalities began. Michael wasn't a man who did symbolic gestures and left things at that. He wanted restitution, and he wanted it to be official. A couple hours after lunch, he texted me with his terms, which were precise and designed to bite only where it would hurt Steve and the firm, not me. 1, he would expect invoices for the resale value of the Super Bowl tickets, a number that, thanks to the market for these things, was far above face value. We were talking more than $10,000. He wanted those invoices paid immediately. 2, he wanted a direct apology to me, in person, from the partner who had made the choice to re-gift the tickets. 3, he also wanted a written apology, addressed to his company, for what he characterized as an act of theft. 4, And finally, he said something that felt like a professional decapitation. He would only interact with me or with another partner going forward, not Steve. He copied me on a formal email outlining these demands and made sure the other partners saw it. That email did its work like a pebble dropped into a calm lake. The ripples were quick and exact. The partners convened, eyebrows knitted, reputations measured, and profit share realities checked. Suddenly, this was not simply about seats. It was about fiduciary responsibility and the optics of client relationships. Steve's casual, unilateral decision to give away a gift intended for me, a direct client relationship, had consequences. What followed was a quiet corporate retribution. The partners decided that Steve should shoulder the financial repercussions. He was required to reimburse the firm for the ticket value and to cover the meal Michael had insisted on as a show of his displeasure. Those invoices, in the end, were paid out of Steve's salary. He lost profit share on future work with that client because Michael transferred his account to another partner. Steve did not get fired, but he was professionally diminished in a way that was loud inside the firm and silent enough outside it to not be a scandal. The goal was correction, not annihilation. There was a peculiar byproduct of all this. I, who had been the victim in the episode, came out looking like the one who had been trying to salvage the client relationship. The partners praised my composure privately. I had handled myself professionally, had not flamed the firm publicly, and had let Michael, the client whose gratitude had been misappropriated, dictate the terms. In the internal politics of a consulting firm, that counts for something. I had turned indignation into leverage without being the one to start the fight. A few months later, I left the firm, not because of the incident exactly, but because a better position had opened and the timing felt right. My departure was clean. I didn't want bitterness to be my souvenir. Michael stayed in contact. In time, he transitioned his business to a competitor. He ultimately left a year later to work with a friend at another firm. I still see him at industry events. We joke about the spectacle sometimes, like two people who have shared a secret handshake. As for Steve, the aftermath lingered. His pride had been dented. His profit share was smaller. The partners had required restitution and made a point about accountability. People in our circles still use the episode as a small morality tale about discretion and client stewardship. It was not pretty, but it was restorative in a practical sense. The person who had redirected a personal gift without consent faced consequences within the firm and in his client relationships. Gratification in that moment was complicated. Part of me reveled in the neatness of Michael's maneuver, the theatrical reveal, the stunned silence, the forced accounting for a selfish choice. Part of me still ached about the tickets. I had missed the possibility of seeing the 49ers live at the most important game of the year, and the loss felt both sporty and absurdly personal. Even though we lost that Super Bowl on television, and even though the scoreboard already decided the fate of that season, a private ledger had been balanced. I got an apology, the firm took responsibility, and Michael made a clear statement about what loyalty looks like. The last bit of revenge, of course, was the small, clean justice that came later. Steve had to answer for the choice in a way that cost him money, reputation, and a client. Michael moved on to a firm that respected him. I moved on to a job that respected me. And every time the 49ers make it to the big games now, Mark rolls his eyes and says, "You'll get yours someday." I'm still waiting to sit in those seats in person. The bitterness has dulled into a joke that I tell friends when we tailgate, the one about how I almost went to the Super Bowl but instead got an elaborate lesson in corporate ethics. It is satisfying in the way a good joke is satisfying. Concise, precise, and carrying the weight of truth. So that's the ending. Not theatrical vengeance, but corrective action that felt fair and final. Lessons were learned, salaries were adjusted, and a firm remembered that gifts meant to be personal shouldn't be redirected like office supplies. I kept my dignity, the client kept his standards, and the man who thought he could quietly repurpose generosity learned that people notice when you take what wasn't yours. Justice, as it turned out, can be very boring. Invoices, internal memos, and a transfer of account. But sometimes boring justice is the sweetest kind. And me? I still have my foam hat in the closet, waiting for the day when I actually get to wear it at the stadium. Go Niners!